Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dean Bastador for our first session of the afternoon. Dean, take it away.
Thanks, Megan. Hello, everybody. As Megan said, my name is Dean Bastador. I'm a senior engineer here at Red Level on our Cloud and Data Center team. I've got just over 11 years in the IT industry total. 7 years I've been working as a Microsoft Cloud consultant / engineer, with Red Level, and then CDH prior to that. And as you guys may or may not know, CDH is now Red Level. So I came over with an acquisition. I'm a Microsoft certified professional for over 6 years, and I've got extensive experience with IT infrastructure, including virtualization, remote desktop, and AVD, which we're going to be talking about today. I've worked in the Azure platform for about 5 years, and in terms of like Office 365, M365, I've been doing projects in that space for about 7 years. So before we kind of jump into AVD, I thought it would be kind of cool to go through, the history of remote desktop services, because ultimately AVD is remote desktop services in Azure with, some extra bells and whistles. So I thought it'd be kind of neat to go through a quick timeline and just kind of show the iterations of, working in a remote environment through remote desktop services and, VMware and some others. So the first place to start is dumb terminals. So, and these are still used today, but dumb terminals are, or were, widely used for task workers. So a lot of like point of sale systems. And the way that they worked was really, they were just output of text or like, very simple pixely graphics. And the idea with these is they would talk back to a mainframe or a server behind the scenes, and the worker would walk up, they would be able to see output from that machine and kind of enter input in, but it's really, there's no processing happening on the dumb terminal itself. So it's just giving you a view into, information that's back on a server. So it was pretty simple, again, just text-based, simple device. So workers wanted to start using multiple applications instead of just having like a single application dumb terminal type scenario. And Microsoft saw this as a need, so they worked with Citrix on some shared licensing, and they developed, the first version of remote desktop services, which is, the Windows NT Terminal Server Edition. So with this one, it was the first iteration, so you could have multiple users on it, but you couldn't share your local devices like your sound or printers, or you couldn't pass files back and forth between the environments. There was still, CAL licensing requirements. There wasn't a real check, which, that came later, and that was a lot of fun. But this was really the first version that used remote desktop protocol. After Windows NT and Windows Server 2000, Windows 2000 kind of iterated a little bit, but really Windows Server 2003 was where it kind of saw a big leap, where you could have farms of these servers and a connection broker, and you could do some load balancing and have a gateway front end and do some more of the, we'll call it modern, even though it's almost 20 years ago now, but some of the modern capabilities that you would get with like a server farm and load balancing. So you could configure it in a cluster. There was local printer integration, automatic reconnection if you got disconnected. You could redirect some of your local drives, audio streams, your clipboard. SSL was now integrated, so there was encryption with the connections. And Windows XP launched at the same time, and you could RDP into your Windows XP box using the same protocol, and there was a built-in client to connect to the servers. So there was also fast user switching, so you could do switch to a different user and kind of switch behind the scenes, and then remote assist was part of that too, and that was for or it was intended for like IT teams to be able to remotely access users' computers and kind of help them out that way. So that was the Windows Server 2003 iteration. 2008 R2, it got even more advanced. Resolution was upped. You could span multiple monitors. There was a max resolution of like 496 by 248 with multiple monitors, but you could at least do it. And the console was more of a unified management. So you weren't having to go to like multiple different like server workloads to kind of manage your system. It was all kind of remote desktop services. So you weren't doing as much with like Windows load balancer or like other kind of bolt-on services. Font smoothing, so a lot of graphical changes. And then the big thing with 2008 R2 was the REMOTEAPP integration. So you could publish out individual apps instead of just the full desktop. So you can kind of see in the screenshot with the work resources, when you logged in, you were kind of presented with a grid view of the remote apps or the full desktops that you could access. You could just share out file shares if you wanted to, or just a browser to get to like an internal server that maybe had a web-based application. So there was also generic plug and play device redirection. So think about like, digital cameras, were all the craze back then. So you could plug in your digital camera and move photos around and things like that, in the remote desktop environment. So it was really starting to, mature. Around the same time, VMware came out with View, which later became Horizon, which was the VDI platform that you could host in-house. So you could have a bunch of ESX hosts, you could set up View, and basically set up desktops for people to log into. And these could be persistent and pooled desktops. So I would have a client on my machine, I would connect, authenticate, and I get to go to my dedicated desktop and do things off of there. It used link clones technology. So there was kind of a master VMDK file. And then as people logged in and they made changes to their desktop environment, it would use like snapshot technology to basically track those changes and assign the snapshots to users. But the big thing with personal desktops in View was really the graphics capabilities that remote desktop just didn't have at the time. So you could do high-end graphics. There were GPU integrations that you could do, and it really kind of raised the bar in terms of working remotely and getting into a remote desktop. So after this, we saw 2012 R2, which more stability improvements, more performance improvements. They redesigned the interface that you use to manage your farm and your brokers. And really they established, the final version of like their control plane, which is their broker, their, connection gateway, the licensing server. So really it kind of hasn't really changed much since then in terms of like the overall architecture. But, it did just have some iterative improvements and some big UI improvements. So, that was 2012 R2. And another big thing, because VMware, you could get GPUs. So of course, Windows had to go and get their version of it. So you could do remote effects and do some GPU supported activities too. After 2012 R2, Server 2016 came out. And Azure was out at that time. And they had in their marketplace kind of a remote desktop in a box kind of solution where you could go into the marketplace, search for remote desktop, and they would have, through their ARM automation, some scripts and things that would set up the control plane and your host pools, or not host pools, but your RD farms at the time. And then the client support, you could use any kind of RD client to get into that environment, but it kind of simplified the deployment. Wasn't really intended for production use, although I saw people use it for production use. But it was mainly like a proof of concept kind of thing where you can go in the marketplace and just deploy this full solution. It's still there, but it's not really talked about as much. So, and the fall 2019 is when WVD was out of public preview and it became kind of mainstream. So this was, basically the predecessor to AVD, but it's that fully Azure Microsoft managed control plane and better user experience. This is when Windows 10 multi-session was released. So instead of users having to go into like a server interface to use Windows, they could get a Windows 10 experience. The user profile disks are now managed by FS Logics instead of the Windows native like user profile disks. users can use search indexing, which is huge because most Microsoft apps will kind of rely on the search indexing services that aren't turned on by default in the server. And you could do both pooled and personal desktops, which I'll talk about later. And the licensing was greatly simplified. So we'll go into kind of all the features, but this was the first iteration of AVD. It was PowerShell based, so you had to, know some PowerShell to get this up and running, but it was pretty cool, and a lot of people adopted it. And it had a lot of great improvements over the 2012 R2, 2016 kind of iterations. So, and then finally we have Azure Virtual Desktop, which is the version that's out today that we're going to be talking about. So this is fully managed within the Azure portal. These are ARM-based deployments. You can also use Terraform. So any of you sort of like DevOps or infrastructure as code people, you can build this right into your templates. There's some canned Azure Monitor functionality. So you can look at your host pool health, number of connections, errors that might be occurring, all sorts of other information right into some kind of pre-baked dashboards. There's also Microsoft Endpoint Manager integration. So you can start to manage your OSs, using Intune or Endpoint Manager and, some of those security policies and even app deployments. With AVD, they finally came out with like the Teams integration, like the really deep Teams integration, and the redirection service. So if you're using Azure Virtual Desktop, you can join a conference call within that remote desktop using Teams, and the audio and video is going to be like a native experience because the client that you're using to connect to AVD is actually redirecting your local audio and video to the team service directly. So it's kind of proxying that on the behalf of AVD. So there's no latency there. It'll behave almost like a native Teams call. So there's also Start VM on Connect, which is great. So, because it's Azure, you're paying as you consume. So there's some automation that you're going to want to do to save costs. And so Start on Connect's a great way to do that, so that as your users need to use their desktops or their pooled desktops, they can connect and start those up as needed. And when they log off, you can have automation to shut it down, and you're only getting charged for when you use it. MSIX app attach. Similar to like user profile this, but instead of profiles, we're attaching applications. So you can have a base image and just keep very simple, maybe just Office on there. And then as the user authenticates and gets into their session, their apps are attached to their session. Multimedia redirection is in preview. So that's video streaming within a browser, within Edge, and some other multimedia capabilities. Windows 11 is in preview. And then screen capture protection. So, if you're in a remote desktop environment, typically the only, you could lock down screen capture within that server, but you're on a native host, you could always use Snagit or something like that to grab the screen if you wanted to. So they built in some capabilities to the client to kind of detect that behavior and block it. And they've made a lot of improvements on FS Logics that we'll talk about too. So before we get into sort of like some of the more nitty-gritty things about AVD, I kind of want to talk about what this product is really solving in terms of business and technical challenges. So, and really, fundamentally, this is a remote desktop platform. So remote workforce is the number one thing. And some of the challenges with the traditional RDP and VDI and that is the user experience. With remote desktop services, you're in the traditional model logging into a server. You're not logging into Windows 10. So your users are getting that server experience, and they're not seeing all the bells and whistles and fancy GUI kind of things that you get with like a Windows client. There's increased security, especially when it comes to authentication. So, modern authentication is fully supported and the way to connect. So we'll talk about that a little bit in further slides, but the technology to manage, remote desktop services is greatly simplified. So essentially you're just managing your session hosts. And we'll talk more about that. Another challenge is that, modern work. So, this is Modern Workplace Summit, but, what does that mean? It's really you know, in most work scenarios, people are moving to like SaaS models. They're not doing these complex application installs on their endpoints anymore, or they have remote workforces that even if they did those installs, they can't really connect to their on-prem infrastructure without a VPN, or, you know, they're using PaaS or something like that, or IaaS. And so this is more of a modern technology that kind of adapts to that more modern work type scenario. So, and it helps to deal with your legacy applications. So say you do have, you know, more of a remote workforce now, you want to do things like touchless provisioning, or, you know, just really thinly provisioned laptops. You can use AVD to kind of still give your users a way to get back to those legacy applications and do what they need to do without, you know, providing VPN or other things like that. So, and then, you know, again, the complexity, you know, highly available RDS is hard, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the first case study that we'll touch on is Man's Lumber. So, you know, Man's Lumber had a, you know, traditional on-premises IT environment for physical locations. They were using, you know, a hypervisor platform, but their servers were pretty aged. They did have some on-premises applications that needed physical access to some of the resources there. So they had to keep things kind of on-prem. And but it was time to do upgrades, so, you know, they kind of engaged with us. We ended up moving everything out to Azure, you know, having a connection back to their on-prem. But, you know, for those legacy applications, we still had to address that. And because they had those complex installs, they were already leveraging remote desktop services to basically install those applications once and then have users log in and use them that way. But, you know, as I said before, you know, to keep that highly available and give that modern experience, it just couldn't be done with like a traditional remote desktop environment. So we came in, we moved all their servers out to Azure. We implemented AVD, we implemented Endpoint Manager, we increased overall just their security posture, and we gave them a single pane of glass to manage their servers, their remote desktop environment, and we did that through just the Azure portal. So we did some training. Now, you know, they're managing everything through Azure. You know, it's much more secure, and the user experience is, you know, their employees are getting that full Windows 10 experience, and all the bells and whistles that come with multi-session Windows 10, as well as like the, you know, the profile management and things like that they weren't really able to get before. So the other case study that we'll be talking about through this presentation is People 2.0. So People 2.0 is a staffing, recruiting, talent procurement. They do some consulting on staffing, and they have a presence in 32 countries. So they had already adopted Azure for their servers and their software development, but they did have more of a remote workforce. And because they're spanned across so many countries and doing these mergers and acquisitions and divestitures and things like that, they just needed a solution that they could quickly spin up and get people in and scale it up and down as needed, and deal with some of those compliance requirements. So we engaged with them. We implemented Endpoint Manager for their devices. We've got personal desktops going with AVD as well as pooled. So now they don't need, you know, client VPN from these unmanaged devices accessing their network. They also created a shared pool for their contingency staff, and we'll talk through what like shared pool versus personal is in later slides. But so they've got shared pools, personal desktops for both their employees, their temp workers, and their developers. So, and then we've done some pretty advanced scaling solutions for them as well to keep costs down. So, you know, I keep talking about like the remote desktop architecture and how complex that is. And, you know, anybody that's kind of managed that on the IT side, you know, they might be thinking it's not that complex, right? You got your gateway, your broker, and licensing, and then your host, right? That's true, but that's not highly available. And that's usually what I see as a non-highly available implementation of remote desktop services. You can get highly available, but it requires usually about 10 servers, you know, because you have 2 gateways, 2 brokers. Your broker is going to need a SQL backend with clustering if you want that highly available, and then your web access. So it gets very complex as you start to look towards like a HA solution for remote desktop. And then your traditional model, you're using like VHDs for your profiles, which are sketchy at best. Anyone that's used them, so they'll know what I'm talking about. So with AVD, that that whole management plane is managed by Microsoft. So they're gonna do all that HA with the gateway and load balancing and web access. So they're taking that off your hands. The only thing you're managing is your images and your actual RD servers and the way that profiles are handled through FS Logics. And Microsoft's managing all the underlying server and compute networking. So it greatly simplifies it. You don't have SSL to manage anymore. You've got global scale, pay as you go. And for your workers that are currently managing like RDS, this is a pretty easy transition because under the hood, it's RD. It's just some of the management capabilities offloaded to Microsoft. So, to speak a little bit more about, the desktop virtualization is, you've got limitless capacity. So, you can deploy different solutions in different geographic regions depending on your needs. So, when we talk about People 2.0 and their, acquisition activities, these are global. So, we can deploy AVD in the West Coast or in Canada or Texas or wherever we need it. And the users are going to get less latency than if, they're hosting their own on-premises solution. So, and it's Azure. So these data centers have multiple availability zones for most of them. Not all of them are the same, but most of them. So if one data center in that region goes down, you still have two more where your stuff can be hosted, and you've got some additional HA there. So really, it was a great solution for short-term employees where people are coming and going, and hey, we need to get them access to the software, but they might only be here for weeks. So are we really going to provision laptops and things like that, or do we really want to give them VPN access into our environment? The answer is no. So we can just add them to a group, tell them, hey, go on the web, connect to your AVD instance. You can get to our software that way. And then if the short-term employees are terminated or they move on or whatever, you just pull them out of the group or disable their account, and now they don't have access. So it's a really scalable solution for that type of activity. And it addresses BYOD, mobile, and those types of scenarios. So, and I've already kind of spoken about this, but best user interface. So they're getting full Windows 10 multi-session. So they're not getting a server interface. They're seeing Server Manager, and they get search, and it's deeply integrated with Office tools, and they can do Teams calls and all these things that they're used to doing on their laptops. Now they can do in a remote desktop environment. They've got enhanced security because now we can do MFA and zero trust and those types of things that Jesse will talk about in his presentation. And then simplified management for your IT because you're not having to manage all of that control plane again. So going back to kind of the case study, we were talking about remote work, geo expansion, rapid growth, and then hardware asset refreshes. So both People 2.0 and Man's Lumber had, similar kind of situations going on, especially with like hardware needs and remote workforce. So this is a great solution for that, because they're not having to expose their internal applications to the internet. They're having their users come in and access those applications through AVD. So those clients that they're accessing that environment from, those can be zero touch, really thinly deployed clients where maybe they're just running Office, they're trusted devices, they're managed in Endpoint Manager. They're not really running anything else, but they're connecting into AVD to get to any of those legacy apps that we don't want to expose out to the internet. And then again, the scalability where users come and go, you can scale them in, you can drop them in different host pools. So we haven't really talked about like the host pool kind of scenario yet, and we will, but you can have different use cases for AVD, whether it's personal desktop or host pool, and even your host pools themselves may have different use cases. But for the user, all they're doing is they're logging into the client. They just see their grid of applications that they've been assigned to, and they just pick one, and they're able to get in. So again, the remote workforce, flexible workforce, contractors. Contractors are a big one where, I'm a contractor for a lot of our customers where I might have to go into a customer environment. And, there was a time not too long ago where I'd have 4, 5, 6 VPN clients running on my laptop because these customers didn't have remote desktop, or I couldn't get to what I needed to from remote desktop, and they didn't want to spin up a whole new remote desktop environment just for me. So I'd end up having to VPN in, and then we kind of had like this agreement, like, hey, you don't have any like malware or anything, right? Because you're kind of connecting to like our sensitive stuff. Or they'd have to like push some antivirus software to my work computer, so then my IT is not happy. So it's just not a great solution. So with AVD, you can create those kinds of like contractor host pools or personal desktops where I'm signing in, it spins up. I do what I need to do. I log out, it spins down. I can poke holes to certain areas of my network that I want that workstation to connect to. So I don't need to give it full blown access to everything or entire subnets. So it's a nice solution. And then because it's it's able to be used through a web interface or through a client on multiple types of devices, it doesn't really matter how, if the contractor uses Mac or Windows or whatever, they can get to the environment. So yeah, I've kind of talked about the platform of choice. So you can connect from any device of your choice. So Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, Linux, or just web. Anything with a browser, basically, you can get in and connect. So cross-platform connectivity. They get a local Windows experience, and even like their plug-and-play devices. There's additional support there. If you're granting that capability. The client, I'm not going to spend too much time on the client on this one because I've got a slide dedicated to that coming up. But the client has dynamically adapting bandwidth. So, if a user is out there and like me out in the middle of nowhere, my internet might be spotty. So, my bandwidth will dynamically adapt to that and kind of like turn off visual things as needed or turn them on. So that's pretty nice. And then FS logics for the user profiles, is nice for, those pooled scenarios, which we'll go into that in a later slide. But real-time Outlook search, all those searching capabilities that all the Office apps use, and even Windows, that's all built into your multi-session Windows. And OneDrive files on demand capabilities, which with the user profile disks, OneDrive files on demand and known folder sync is a great solution that we usually do for basically all our clients that have licensing for that. We've already talked about team enhancements, but that's really the redirection of your audio and video through the AVD client so that you get a native conference call experience versus latency that you would get with your traditional RDP. So I said we talk about the client in a later slide, and here it is. So this is kind of a screenshot grabbed of the client. So it does look similar to like even the Windows 2008 R2, when you go into the web and you just have that grid of icons, this is a similar experience. So, so users that are used to using RDP, they're going to come in here and go, okay, like here's my stuff. I know what to do with this. And you'll see that there's like a workspace there, the CSW workspace. So you can have multiple workspaces. So if you think about like, different business units or, different geographic locations, you can split up the, applications and where they're published based on those things. So it's really flexible in the way that you can present it to the users, and your users will appreciate that. There is, modern auth support for this. So with your traditional RDP, I've seen this too many times where RDP is just published to the internet and they're not sometimes even using the gateway. So they'll just open up port 3389 to the internet and people will be hitting that and they'll get hacked eventually. And to get around that, you get the gateway service, of course, but that's added complexity. So this client, because Microsoft is taking that control plane and managing it for you, this client is doing the authentication to your Azure AD account. So all of your conditional access policies, all your MFA, all of that stuff that Jesse's going to talk about you can use all of that with this client. You're not doing just username and password. There's some additional checks. And then something I really want to talk about is universal print. And this isn't specific to AVD. This can be used with any Windows 10, but any Windows 10 endpoint that's managed in Endpoint Manager anyway, I should say. But because you can manage AVD, at least the personal desktops fully in Endpoint Manager, you can deploy printers through Endpoint Manager through Universal Print. And Universal Print is a cloud service. So you've got your on-premises printers, your print server, and you're adding those printers to your Universal Print services. So they're managing like a spooler service and the drivers in the cloud. And then you have an endpoint that's set up to use those. So when the user sends their print job to the printer, it's going up to Azure's Universal Print service and then down to the printer. So you can essentially print from anywhere. You don't need to be on the same LAN as the printer. So that's nice for remote workforce if they need to like send a print job somewhere and they're not necessarily next to the printer or even in the same building. They can do that, or if you don't have line of sight from your Azure environment to where those printers are hosted, you can use Universal Print to get around those kinds of scenarios. So finally, we can talk about pooled and personal. So pooled is a traditional kind of multiple users are logging into a farm of hosts. And so that host pool can be pretty big or pretty small, however, depending on your needs. You can make multiple host pools. The VMs in those host pools can be different VM sizes. And then you're just assigning a group of users to that pool. And then when they log in, based on the load balancing algorithm, they're going to get put on one of the hosts somewhere. So in the load balancing algorithm, it'll do depth or breadth. So, if you think of depth, it's like, I'm going to get server 1 filled up all the way with as many sessions as I can. Once I hit that limit, I'm going to start filling up server 2 and server 3 and so on. Breadth is like, okay, user 1, you go to server 1, user 2, go to server 2, and does that round robin kind of load balancing. So both of those are options. With the pooled, you're really going to need FS logics, and that is, if your user is going to get put on one of 20 servers, then you're going to want to make sure that the user has the same user experience no matter which server they get put on. So FS logics is a way to keep the user profile data in a disk that kind of dynamically gets mounted to the host as the user logs in. With pooled, it's important to use some automation scripting for deprovisioning and provisioning. And the reason for that is you might have a pool of 20 hosts or more, and maybe they're only used 8 hours of the day, and it's Azure, so you're getting charged for what you consume. So you're going to want to make sure that the hosts are running only when you need them to run, and they're not running all night, just running up the bill. And then you can use Start on Connect to kind of help with that as well, where the first user in the morning, they come in, they log in, and that first host spins up, based on that connection. Personal is more of a one-to-one mapping. So, me, Dean, I log in, I get put on Dean's workstation, and every time I log in, I'm put on that same one. I can, load software on there. I can unload software. I can kind of manage that, or, I can be just a standard user. And kind of relate this back to our case study with People 2.0. We did both of these. So like for the temp workers, they had a pooled environment, and their contingency staff, and even their remote employees, they had a different pool. So users would log in, they get put into the pool, and then we just manage the image and the software installs on the back end. For their developers, however, they needed something a little more beefy, and developers need different software installs to do their work. So, and they might need administrative access to their workstations. So, so they got put on the personal type pool scenario. So it worked out great. We were able to kind of blend it, and based on what they needed, come up with some good solutions. You can still use FS logics with personal, but if you're getting assigned to the same machine every day, it may not be needed. But you can do automatic assignment where it's not necessarily the same machine every day, but it is still a machine and you're not sharing it with others, where maybe it's just based on a golden image, but you don't want multiple users logging into the same machine. So, depending on the scenario, we would work through that and figure out, the best use. And I've mentioned FS logics a lot here. And this is, again, what is mounting that user profile. So, so that users get that same experience no matter where they're logging in. It will kind of do a detection, say, hey, the user logged off, make sure that this disk gets disconnected. And when they log in, make sure it does get connected. And it's got a lot more checks than like your traditional user profile disk had in like the native Windows experience. So, and this is controlled through GPO, and it's great. It's a great technology for anyone that's like managed the user profile disk. This is much better. And then along sort of the same lines, we have MSIX attach, which is, similar but different. So instead of the user profile getting dynamically assigned, you have the application getting dynamically attached. So, and these applications are in VHDs, and they just get mounted to the session host and presented to the user. So you can assign users to applications, and when they sign in, they get the applications they need. When they sign out, those get unmounted. So it's nice because it makes it so you don't have to manage an image and install all your apps on one image, and then kind of restrict folders depending on who the users are. It takes away that complexity. And this is an AVD only technology. So we're kind of coming near the end of my time, but I did want to talk about Windows 365. So this is a new offering from Microsoft that was just announced in the last, couple of months. And it's similar to AVD, but different. And I kind of want to talk through the differences here. So in AVD, you're, as I said, you're kind of on a metered connection. So as you use the product, you're getting charged for it. And if you turn it off, you're not getting charged for it. So you have to take that into account and maybe build some automation and things like that to scale up, scale down. With Windows 365, you're just paying for a subscription. That machine's there any time of the day you need it. You don't have to worry about it, being powered on and getting charged for it. So it kind of simplifies that. But price-wise, you're going to probably end up paying a little more, but you don't have to worry about the metered connection. Another big difference is the difficulty. So even though AVD is quite a bit more simple than like your traditional RDP, it is pretty difficult. You still need staff to set up the Azure Virtual Desktop networking, make sure that your network security groups are right, and you have antivirus, and you're locking down, what those machines can connect to in terms of like your LAN or your different VNets. So you're still doing a lot of the Azure management. You're still doing a lot of image management and that kind of thing. So with Windows 365, especially the business tier, you're like Microsoft is just managing all that. So the difficulty is quite a bit less with Windows 365. And this kind of talked through that already, but yeah, with Azure Virtual Desktop, you do, I would say this is a plus, but I'm a technical person. I do like the flexibility that you get with AVD because you can manage your images and you can have that automation in place, and you have a bunch of different use cases that you could kind of have different pools for, or personal versus pooled and those kinds of things. Whereas Windows 365, it's just, you have a user, they get assigned to a desktop. It's pretty simple, but it's 100% Microsoft managed. So if you don't have IT, that's probably the way to go. The big difference here is that with AVD, you do get that traditional RDP pooled style connection as an option. You can do the 1-to-1 ratio as well, but you do get the option of pooled. Windows 365, it's a 1-to-1 every time. You don't have pooled desktops, so there's no multi-session going on. And then I found this table I just wanted to throw up because instead of talking through every single difference, I just kind of wanted to hit on the big ones. But I think the biggest takeaway is probably that with Windows 365 for Business, it's a fully managed like cloud PC. You're just logging into it. Microsoft manages the networking, the applications on it. You're just getting Office. You can do a little bit of self rebooting, things like that, but it's fully managed. The enterprise version does give you some flexibility. You can join it to a VNet and give it access to your network resources. You can even still manage the image that you're deploying to your users as well. So there's for the people that like to tinker on the back end, you get a lot more options to make your users get a better experience there. So that is Azure Virtual Desktop. So I guess at this point, let's go to questions.
All right, thank you, Dean. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A panel. We have a couple of questions in here already. So first question, is there a path to upgrade from WVD to AVD?
Kind of. So WVD, is the pre-ARM template version of this solution. And you do have hosts and host pools. So you can retain those same hosts and reuse them in AVD. But you do have to go into the AVD portal, recreate your host pools, recreate your access, your application groups, your workspaces. You do need to recreate all that. But as far as the VMs that are running that are members of the WVD host pool, it's a matter of removing that WVD agent and then adding the AVD agent and associating it with the new AVD solution. So it's not a click, I want to upgrade kind of upgrade, but there's a path.
Next question, can an organization have a mix of AVD and Windows 365?
Yes. Yep. AVD is, it's in your subscription, you set it up, you can assign users to it, and Microsoft or Windows 365 is a completely different product that you assign that to your users. It's a different console you go into and you assign them. So yeah, they can run side by side.
Okay. Is AVD or Windows 365 capable of supporting high-end programs like CAD?
Yes, but it can get pretty costly. So you can do the N series VMs, which are like the NVIDIA's, and I believe you can also do like the AMD versions of that as well now. But so you can have the high-end graphic back end. You can create pools or personal desktops. It's probably most cost effective to do like the personal desktops. So users are getting that one-to-one and they're not having to share the GPU. But it can get costly, but those laptops can get costly too. So it just kind of depends on what you're looking for and how high end you want to go.
Okay, another question. You touched on some cost saving options with AVD. How do we achieve those savings?
So with AVD, you're paying as you consume. So your cost savings are the automation that turns things on and turns things off as users use it. So if you think of a pool of 20 servers, as far as Azure is concerned, those are VMs that you're running and you've got a meter running as you use them. So you can turn those things off when you're not using them, save costs. You can also do reserved instances, which will save quite a bit of cost. If you're going to use the solution for 3 years, reserve the instances. You can even do a blend of turning things off and reserved instances. It's not a one-to-one reserved instance to VM ratio, but you can see additional savings. And then buying your Windows licensing through, like an open licensing program with SA will save you a ton of costs. We got one customer down to like $11, $12 per host in AVD for, I think it was 8 cores and 16 gigs of RAM. So you can get them pretty cheap.
Okay, let's see. Speaking of costs, how many Azure hosted hosts can a host pool host?
So the question I think is how many hosts can you have in a host pool? And I don't have the answer off the top of my head. You can have a lot, but probably you'd want to create more host pools than just putting tons of hosts in a single host pool, depending on the need, but yeah.
Okay. And then can you use Azure Active Directory for authentication to the host, or do you need a DC?
For the pooled hosts, you need Active Directory, either your own DC, or you can use Azure Active Directory Services, which is a managed Active Directory service. You can use Azure AD, which is something totally different, with your personal desktops, and that was just announced, but not for your pooled desktops yet. But I know that's something that they're working towards.
Okay. Can you explain how Azure Virtual Desktop can be used across regions?
Yes, when you create your host pools, you're going through a wizard where you're setting up things like your host sizes, where they're going to be authenticating to, and then one of the options is the region that your host pool is going to be hosted in. So if you have users in the West Coast, you would create that host pool and pick the West Coast, data center region, and if it's in the East Coast, just pick the East Coast data center region. But you have to be careful because there's a lot of stuff underneath that you need to be aware of. Like if you've got all your production environment in the East Coast and you spin up just AVD in the West Coast, they still need a DC to authenticate against. So now you're looking at, how do you just make globally, scalable Azure networking and hub and spoke and that kind of thing. So something like that takes a lot of planning to get it right, but that's essentially how you do it.
Okay. Can you use Azure storage accounts as the user profile disks storage repository?
Yes, and that is the preferred way to do it. So you create SMB file shares in Azure storage accounts and you Active Directory integrate those, which is, there's a module and some PowerShell that you need to do to make that happen. Once those storage accounts are AD integrated, they work just like any file share. And then at that point, you point your FSLogix UNC to that file share, and you're using NTFS permissions the same way you would with a regular file share.
All right, and then I think two more questions. How do you determine how many users can concurrently use a server on AVD?
So this one's tricky because there's not a hard and fast rule. There's some guidance from Microsoft that says that when you're starting out, depending on your workload, they've got a user to core ratio that you start with. So if it's a moderate workload, I believe it's a 3 to 4 user per core. So that's per core on the host that you're doing. So based on that, you would do your pilot, have them do some work, and then look at the performance of the host and then adjust from there. So it's similar to like your traditional RDP where it's kind of trial error, look at your application loads, look at your user counts, look at your number of cores, and takes a little bit of IT experience and just kind of looking into it.
Okay, and that kind of tees up the next question that just came in. If someone is considering going to AVD, what are the first steps they should take?
It's really look at your licensing, because in AVD, your licensing is, it's a per user license that comes with like similar to like Office 365, but you need the Windows 10 enterprise licensing. So if you've got that already through like an EA or through your M365 licensing, then you're already good. So that would be the first thing to kind of cover is that cost. And then maybe think about what you're trying to get out of it. If you just want an environment for people to run Office apps in and things like that, I would say it's probably not the best use case for AVD because you can get that experience on a laptop and your users would probably prefer that. But if you have those like legacy application scenarios or things that you need to stay on the LAN and you can't do SaaS or those kinds of solutions, then those are perfect use cases for AVD. And then it's just a matter of figuring out, okay, how do we set up our VNet to connect to our LAN? If you have LAN resources, plan that out. Look at some common Azure VNet architectures, hub spoke, N-tier. Get your DC up there and start learning from there. But if you're curious about that, come talk to us. We can help you with that.
Absolutely. Then let's see here. One last question. How do I control who can access the environment?
You can do that in a few different ways. So, and this is a great one because Jesse's going to talk about zero trust after this. But you can control who ultimately can just access the environment, and you do that through a security group in Azure. And then once you've decided who can access it, you can layer on some additional controls because, again, the client is going to use modern authentication. So that opens up the doors for zero trust. And, is this user on a trusted device? Are they being MFA challenged? Is it a risky sign-in event? Those kinds of things. But ultimately, it's a group who has access, and then your security controls on top of that.
Okay. Well, that is all of the questions that we have right now. I would like to thank everyone